Millionaire walks into the bank just before Thanksgiving, only to be paralyzed when he saw a teller airing the golden pendant he had given his daughter before she went missing 20 years ago. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. The house on Willow Lane stood as a testament to warmth and laughter in simpler times. Its wide front porch, painted a soft blue, held years of summer evenings, the sound of laughter and whispered secrets wrapped around the beams like an invisible blanket. Inside, framed photographs of a grinning young girl with curly hair and bright eyes occupied every surface, each image echoing a different moment of pure happiness. Grant Walker, with his crisp suits and focused gaze, once balanced his high-stakes career with his role as a father and husband. Laura, his wife, matched his ambition with her own spark, her career in publishing blossoming alongside their family life. Despite the pressures, they worked in tandem, Laura editing manuscripts at the kitchen table while Grant closed deals on calls that Emily would interrupt with giggles and playful mischief. Emily was their light, their center, the bridge that connected their sometimes disparate worlds. One winter morning, Grant watched from the kitchen doorway as Laura taught Emily how to decorate cookies. Flour dusted Emily's tiny nose, and Laura laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. That day, Grant had gifted Emily the golden pendant, a delicate oval with tiny etched flowers. It had taken months to find, chosen for its intricate beauty and the way it symbolized their shared love. "Daddy, does this mean I'm your princess?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with wonder as he clasped it around her neck. "Always," he whispered, kissing her forehead. But life has a way of shifting in ways no one sees coming. The day started like any other, Emily playing in the yard, her laughter threading through the open windows, while Grant juggled back-to-back meetings. Thunderheads gathered by evening, casting the sky in hues of deep gray and indigo. The rain began with a splatter, soft at first, then turning into a fierce, unrelenting downpour. Grant barely noticed the storm until the power flickered and died, leaving the house cloaked in darkness. Panic surged in the pit of his stomach as he fumbled for the flashlight, its weak beam casting long, shifting shadows down the hallway. "Laura," he called, his voice edged with worry as he reached the bottom of the staircase. Upstairs, Emily's room stood eerily quiet, the only sound the wind howling outside. The curtains fluttered as if caught in a silent dance, and a window, left ajar, slammed against the sill with a sudden bang. Grant's flashlight caught the empty bed, the tousled blankets, and the golden pendant glistening on the floor like an accusation. By the time Laura rushed in, her face pale and voice shrill with terror, Grant was already dialing the police. What followed was a blur, sirens, frantic searches through the rain-soaked woods, and questions that held no answers. Neighbors whispered and exchanged worried glances, police radios crackled with static. Days turned to weeks, and the absence of their daughter settled into their lives like a shadow. The strain split the seams of their marriage, turning every shared glance into a reminder of what was lost. Laura's grief became too sharp to bear in the home where Emily's laughter once rang. Boxes were packed in silence, final papers were signed with shaking hands. Soon, Laura was gone, leaving Grant alone in the house that felt hollow without the life it once sheltered. Grant's days became driven by work, the only thing he knew how to do without breaking down. Yet every now and then, he would find himself in Emily's room, sitting on the edge of the bed, tracing the fading paint on her dresser and clutching the golden pendant to his chest. His once picture-perfect life was reduced to a room, a keepsake, and memories that refused to fade. Laura, on the other hand, found a small town where no one knew her past, where mornings were quiet and unburdened by familiar sights. But grief, she realized, isn't tied to a place. It follows, lingers, fills the spaces between each heartbeat. She'd pause, sometimes, when she heard a child's laughter outside her window, her hands stilling over a cup of tea as her mind wandered back to a different life. What neither of them knew was that the years apart were only the beginning of the story. The pendant, once a cherished token, had not disappeared along with Emily. It was out there, a small thread tying the past to an uncertain future. 20 years had passed, but the questions remained, suspended like dust in the air, waiting for the day they would resurface and demand answers. The city pulsed with a mechanical rhythm, each corner lined with tall buildings that cast deep shadows across the streets. Grant Walker moved through it all like a man made of stone, his face set with the kind of determined grimness that only years of loss could carve. The world had changed, and so had he. Suits tailored perfectly, graying hair swept back, his presence commanded respect tinged with the undercurrent of fear that success often brings. Beneath that polished exterior, however, was a man perpetually haunted by the past. It was on an otherwise forgettable Tuesday that Grant's day took an unexpected turn. What began as a routine trip to his bank to oversee investments and sign a few papers spiraled into a moment he would never forget. The bank lobby was pristine, sunlight streaming through the large glass windows that stretched up to meet polished marble floors. Grant barely registered the hum of people moving around him or the whispers of business talk that filled the air. His focus was set, as usual, on the task at hand. "Mr. Walker, this way please," called one of the senior tellers, a middle-aged man with a tidy appearance and a practiced smile. Grant nodded, following mechanically. The pen hovered in his hand over the dotted line of a contract and a movement caught his attention, a small flicker, like a ghost stirring at the edge of his vision. He turned, and the world seemed to narrow, shrinking until there was only her. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair pinned neatly and an earnest expression as she worked behind the counter. But that wasn't what made Grant's heart stutter and his breath catch. Around her neck, resting against the collar of her uniform, was the golden pendant. The same one he had clasped around Emily's small neck all those years ago. The paper slipped from his hands, the sound of it hitting the floor startlingly loud in his ears. Grant's mouth went dry, his pulse thundering in his temples. He forced himself to look away, to draw in a breath before turning back. Yes, it was still there, unmistakable with its tiny etched flowers that had once brought a child's smile to her face. His hands clenched at his sides, a wave of memories surging against the dam he'd built around his heart. "Mr. Walker? Is everything all right?" The teller's voice sounded muffled, as if coming from underwater. Grant barely managed a nod, eyes locked on the young woman. She noticed his stare, brow furrowing as she glanced at him before shifting nervously under his gaze. He had to be sure. Without thinking, he stepped forward, leaving the teller mid-sentence and striding over to the counter where the girl worked. She looked up, eyes wide with surprise as he stood there, unblinking. The moments dragged like hours. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude," Grant began, his voice rough. "But that pendant. Where did you get it?" Sophia blinked, her fingers reaching instinctively to touch the delicate piece hanging around her neck. Confusion clouded her face, followed by the faintest flicker of something deeper, an unnameable tug at her memory. "It was given to me by my parents when I was little," she said hesitantly, brows knitting together. "Is there a problem, sir?" Grant swallowed hard, his throat tight as the implications hit him like a tidal wave. He fought to keep the tremor from his voice. "Your parents, are they local? Could I speak to them?" A beat of silence passed, heavy and tense. Sophia's guard went up, her fingers curling protectively around the pendant. "I'm sorry, but I don't think that's something I can just—" "Please," Grant interrupted, softer now, the desperation seeping into his tone. The young teller's eyes shifted, sensing the strain beneath the polished exterior. She bit her lip, glancing at the clock as if looking for an escape. "Maybe it's better if we talk another time." "I can't leave right now," she offered, her voice quieter now, uncertain. Grant stepped back, realizing the intensity of his approach. He nodded, stepping aside as the room seemed to buzz around him again, a cacophony he could barely process. He watched her, the way she returned to her work but kept sneaking glances his way, the pendant catching the light with each small movement. It was undeniable now, there was more than coincidence in that encounter. The walk back to his car felt dreamlike, his mind racing through memories long buried. The echoes of Emily's laughter, the touch of her small hand in his, the stormy night when she vanished, all of it resurfaced with a vividness that took his breath away. And now, that pendant, impossibly back in front of him after 2 decades. The realization hit him as he gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. He needed to call Laura. Their separation had been silent, like a wound no one talked about. But this was a spark that might lead them back to answers they'd stopped daring to hope for. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the contact on his phone that hadn't been used in years. The line rang, each tone slicing through him until it clicked to voicemail. He hung up, staring out the window at the city blurred by his unfocused eyes. The past was stirring, reaching for him, and for the first time in decades, he allowed it to. The phone felt heavier in Grant's hand than it ever had before. It had taken him hours to work up the nerve to make the call. The encounter with Sophia, the pendant glistening on her chest, had set every old wound ablaze. Now, with trembling fingers, he pressed the contact that had been buried in his phone for years. The dial tone droned, each repetition scraping at his nerves until a click signaled the end of its torment. "Hello?" Laura's voice, distant and unfamiliar, sent a shiver through him. The years had added an edge to it, a guarded quality that spoke of battles fought alone. Grant hesitated, the silence stretching long enough for her to sigh, impatient. "Grant? What is it? Why are you calling?" He swallowed, willing his voice to steady. "Laura, I need to talk to you. It's about Emily." A sharp intake of breath, then silence. He could almost see her, eyes narrowing, mouth pressed into a thin line. Her silence spoke volumes. It was a boundary she had built over years, one she wasn't ready to dismantle. "You think it's fair to bring this up now? After everything?" Laura's voice was cold, but the crack at its edges betrayed her. "I wouldn't call if it wasn't important," Grant said, leaning against his car, the night pressing around him. He took a breath, each word careful. "I saw something today. A young woman, wearing Emily's pendant. The one I gave her." The line went so quiet he thought the call had dropped. Then, Laura spoke, and the tremor in her voice betrayed her shock. "The pendant? Are you sure?" "Without a doubt." "It was hers, Laura," he said, the words catching in his throat. The memory of that delicate piece, clasped around Emily's neck all those years ago, burned in his mind. Silence enveloped them once more, each lost in their own storm of thoughts. Grant imagined her on the other end, somewhere far from the city lights, surrounded by the quiet life she had built for herself. He wondered if she was standing by the window, fingers brushing the edge of a photograph she'd never put away. Laura's voice, quieter now, returned. "I need to know everything. Start from the beginning." Grant recounted his day at the bank, the moment he saw Sophia and the rush of recognition. He spared no detail, each description weighed with significance. When he finished, there was a long pause, broken only by the sound of Laura exhaling, a tremor still in her breath. "I never thought," Laura's words trailed off, heavy with all the things she couldn't say. Memories surged, those days spent searching, hope diminishing with each dead end. But now, something flickered in her, fragile but insistent. "I'll come to the city," she said, the decision final, cutting through the uncertainty. "Laura, are you sure?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. It had been so long since they'd shared anything but the distance between them. "Yes," she said, and there was a strength in her voice that hadn't been there before. "If there's even a chance that it's connected to Emily, I need to see it myself." The following morning, Laura packed with a deliberate calm, her hands steady even as her mind spun with memories and questions. Her small house, filled with soft, neutral colors and the scent of lavender, felt foreign now as she prepared to leave it behind. She glanced at a photo on her bedside table, one taken during a happier time, Emily at a park, cheeks flushed, eyes sparkling. It was a moment suspended in the past, untouched by what had followed. The train ride to the city was long, each mile tugging her closer to memories she'd worked hard to keep at bay. She stared out the window at the passing landscape, the rhythm of the train matching the thudding in her chest. It was as if the past was pulling her back, refusing to be ignored any longer. When she finally stepped into the city station, its noise and movement overwhelmed her for a moment. The air was thick with exhaust and conversation, a far cry from the quiet she'd become accustomed to. And then she saw him, Grant, standing near the exit, looking out of place in a sea of travelers. His hair was grayer now, his face lined with years of worry and work. Yet, when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile truce drawn by the weight of shared loss. "Laura," Grant said, his voice careful, as if afraid to shatter whatever tentative understanding they were forming. "Let's go," she replied, not wanting to give herself a moment to falter. The conversation would come, the questions, the pain, but first, there was something they needed to confront together. They drove in silence, the city blurring past them. Grant stole glances at her, taking in the way she'd changed yet remained so achingly familiar. She noticed, of course, but said nothing, keeping her gaze forward, fixed on the unknown ahead. Arriving at the cafe where they had agreed to meet Sophia, Laura felt her breath catch. It was a small place, tucked on a corner bustling with life. The smell of roasted coffee mingled with the crisp autumn air. She wrapped her coat tighter around her, the anticipation building into a sharp point in her chest. The young woman was already inside, seated near a window, unaware of the two people approaching who carried the weight of an old grief. Sophia looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from casual curiosity to wary recognition when she spotted Grant. Laura's heart pounded as she saw the pendant gleaming against Sophia's shirt. Time seemed to freeze, everything narrowing to that small piece of jewelry. It felt like the past was staring back at her, defiant and unforgiving. "Hi, I'm Laura," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling inside her. Sophia's eyes widened slightly, as if she could sense that this meeting was about more than just a simple conversation. "I'm Sophia," the young woman replied, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. And so, the search for answers began anew. Grant opened the door to his penthouse, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a fortress shielding him from the world. Laura stood there, framed by the city skyline that blazed in the evening light, her expression carefully neutral. Time had etched lines into her face, softening the once sharp edges of her cheekbones, but her eyes still carried the same fire. He stepped aside, motioning her in with a silent nod. The room was impeccably designed, glass and steel, cold in its perfection. Yet with Laura's presence, it was as if the air itself shifted. Her eyes roved over the polished surfaces, pausing at a framed photo of Emily that Grant had never been able to put away. A pang twisted in her chest, but she said nothing, not yet. "Thank you for coming," Grant said, breaking the silence, his voice gravelly with restraint. Laura turned to face him, a small, tight smile playing at her lips. "I didn't come for you," she said quietly. The words stung, but Grant nodded, accepting them as truth. They were here for Emily, or whatever thread of her might remain. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward, punctuated by the muffled sounds of city life below. Grant motioned to the sofa, and Laura sank into it, folding her hands in her lap. He sat across from her, both of them unable to ignore how strange it felt to be in the same room after years apart. They had shared so much once: laughter, whispered dreams, and the quiet comfort of raising their daughter together. Now, they were strangers brought back together by the echo of loss. "I need you to tell me everything again," Laura said, breaking the spell. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in the set of her jaw, the way her fingers tightened around each other. Grant leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He spoke with precision, recounting the sight of Sophia and the pendant gleaming against her uniform, the shock that had washed over him like ice water. Each detail seemed to pull them back to that night 20 years ago: the thunder, the empty bed, the sound of Laura's broken cries as they searched in vain. When he finished, the room was silent, thick with the weight of what hadn't been said. Laura exhaled, her eyes drifting to the photo again. "If she's wearing that pendant," she whispered, more to herself than to him, "there's something real here." The bitterness they'd clung to over the years, the blame and resentment that had kept them apart, seemed to fade in the face of this shared hope. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. Grant nodded. "I thought you'd want to meet her," he said. His voice was softer now, almost vulnerable, as if inviting her to share the burden that had been solely his for so long. Laura looked up, the fire in her eyes sparking again. "Of course I do," she said, the edge of determination cutting through her fatigue. "We need to know who she is, where she comes from, and how she got that pendant." They agreed to meet Sophia the next day, a plan that set their minds in motion but left them with too many hours of waiting. Laura stayed the night in the guest room, once an impersonal space, now filled with the electricity of the past. She couldn't sleep, memories rushing in like an uninvited tide. The sound of Emily's giggles, the warmth of her little hand reaching for hers, and the soft cadence of her voice as she told stories before bed. These memories, once a source of pain, now felt like signposts leading her back to something she wasn't sure she dared to find. In the early hours, unable to lie still any longer, Laura found herself in the living room, drawn to that photo. Grant was already there, sitting in an armchair with a cup of cold coffee, eyes distant until he noticed her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, the question simple but layered with understanding. "No," she admitted, crossing her arms and looking out over the city that stretched endlessly before them. "Too much in my head." Grant didn't press her. The silence that followed felt different, less an awkward pause, more a space where grief could breathe, shared without words. "I used to wonder," Laura said, her voice soft, "if she was out there somewhere, thinking of us. If she remembered anything at all." Grant's throat tightened. "Me too," he said, the confession pulling at something deep inside him. They were parents, after all, no matter how many years had passed or how life had broken them down. The hours rolled on until the sun climbed over the city, bathing everything in a light that felt too bright, too new for what they were about to face. By late morning, they were on their way to the cafe. The short ride felt endless, each traffic light an unwelcome pause in the building momentum. When they arrived, Sophia was already there, sitting near the window with her hands wrapped around a cup. She looked up as they walked in, her expression shifting from curiosity to cautious recognition. Laura's breath caught when she saw the pendant up close, its gold glinting in the light. Sophia, Grant said, managing a smile that felt awkward and forced. Laura stood beside him, eyes fixed on the young woman who now held the center of their attention. "Hi," Sophia said, glancing between them, clearly uneasy but polite. "You wanted to see me again?" Laura stepped forward, her voice trembling only slightly. "Yes. I'm Laura. We need to talk about that pendant. Where it came from." Sophia's eyes darkened with a flicker of something, confusion, fear, perhaps even a small spark of recognition. She reached up, fingers brushing the delicate chain. "My parents told me it was given to me when I was little, but they never said by who." Laura's hand instinctively reached for her own pendant, the one that had matched Emily's so many years ago. The truth lay somewhere in that room, just out of reach, but closer than it had been in decades. The cafe was small and unassuming, tucked away on a corner that seemed immune to the city's constant hum. The scent of brewed coffee and cinnamon wafted through the air, mingling with the soft murmur of conversation. Grant and Laura sat at a table near the window, their silence heavy with anticipation. Laura's hands trembled, the slightest quiver running through her fingers as she absent-mindedly twisted the thin band of her ring, a habit she thought she'd left behind years ago. When the door opened, they both turned, hearts leaping. Sophia stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on them. She hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features before she made her way over, holding a cautious smile. She was dressed simply, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that accentuated her clear, curious eyes. Around her neck, the pendant gleamed softly, a golden echo of a past no one had quite let go. "Thank you for meeting us," Laura said, her voice calm but brittle, like glass that could shatter at any moment. Sophia slid into the seat across from them, folding her hands in front of her. "It's okay. I've been thinking about what you said," she admitted, glancing nervously at the pendant. "It felt strange, like I should know more but didn't." Grant leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze searching. "We wouldn't have asked to see you again unless it was important," he said. The effort it took to keep his voice steady was monumental, but he managed. "This pendant, it belonged to our daughter, Emily." Sophia's expression shifted, eyes widening with an unreadable mix of emotions. "Your daughter," she repeated softly. Her fingers touched the pendant, tracing the etched flowers as if seeking answers hidden in its delicate lines. "She disappeared when she was 6, Laura continued, her voice breaking for the first time. "We tried everything to find her. We never gave up hope, but life went on, even when we didn't want it to." Her eyes, glistening, met Sophia's, searching for something, anything, that would make sense of the moment. The young woman looked down, a crease forming between her brows as if she were trying to force a memory to the surface. "When I was little, I used to dream about a voice singing to me. I never knew if it was real or just something I imagined." She glanced up, meeting Laura's gaze, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around them. Laura's breath caught, a memory rushing back with startling clarity. She had sung to Emily every night, a lullaby passed down through generations. The tune, soft and lilting, filled her mind, unbidden. Without thinking, she hummed the first few notes, the sound barely audible but enough to draw a reaction from Sophia. The young woman's eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth, tears welling up as if she'd touched a long-buried part of herself. "That song," Sophia whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I remember that song." Grant's chest tightened. He reached out but stopped himself, fingers hovering above the table. Laura's tears spilled over as she watched Sophia's expression change from confusion to a kind of recognition. "I always felt different growing up," Sophia continued, voice quivering. Like I didn't quite fit with my family. My parents, they were good to me, but they never wanted to talk about where I came from. The pendant glinted under the cafe lights as if it held its own secrets. Grant finally spoke, his voice low, brimming with a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Do you remember anything else? Anything from when you were very young? Sophia closed her eyes, trying to piece together the fragments that floated just out of reach. There were times when I'd see flashes, a room with yellow curtains, the sound of rain tapping on the window. And hands, someone's hands, warm and gentle, giving me this. She opened her eyes, looking down at the pendant as though seeing it for the first time. Laura wiped at her cheeks, unable to stop the sob that escaped her. The yellow curtains. She had sewn them herself, choosing the brightest fabric she could find so that Emily's room would always be sunny, even on the rainiest days. It felt as if a barrier had cracked open, letting in light she hadn't dared hope for. Sophia's gaze softened as she met Laura's eyes, something raw passing between them. I don't know how I ended up where I did, but this feels like a piece of something I've been missing. Grant felt a mixture of joy and anguish twisting inside him, emotions fighting for space. We need to know more, he said, glancing at Laura before looking back at Sophia. Would you be willing to find out? To see where this leads? Sophia took a breath, shaky but determined. I want to know, too, she said, her voice steadier now. I think I always have. Laura reached out, this time not hesitating, and placed her hand over Sophia's. It was a simple touch, but it felt monumental. Sophia didn't pull away, instead, she held on, a tentative smile breaking through the tears. The cafe around them buzzed with life, people unaware of the quiet, extraordinary moment unfolding at the corner table. The past and present seemed to merge, woven together by the pendant that had once been a gift, a promise, and now, perhaps, a sign that the story wasn't over yet. Laura had never been one to let questions linger unanswered. The cafe meeting with Sophia reignited something fierce in her, a fire she thought had dimmed after years of grief. As the city awoke to its usual hum of traffic and voices, she stood by her living room window, phone clutched tightly in her hand. It was time to shake the dust from the past and look for the overlooked details that could lead to the truth. Her first call was to Helen, an old friend from her days volunteering at the community center. Helen had connections in the local police force, and if anyone could help reopen doors long closed, it was her. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice greeted her. Laura. It's been ages, Helen said, warmth cutting through the distance of time. I wish this was a social call, Helen, Laura replied, her voice strained but resolute. I need your help. It's about Emily. A pause stretched between them, the weight of Laura's words filling the silence. Helen's voice softened. Tell me what you need. Within hours, Laura found herself poring over old police records spread across her kitchen table, pages yellowed and edges worn. Notes jotted hastily in the margins brought memories rushing back, names, dates, the frustrations that had come with every dead end. It wasn't long before she knew she needed to reach out to the one person who had worked the case more tirelessly than anyone else. Daniel Crawford, now retired and living in a small cabin by the lake, was the detective who had once promised they'd find Emily. The years had not dulled his sharp eyes when he opened the door to find Laura standing on his porch, the cold wind whipping at her hair. He blinked, surprise giving way to recognition. Laura, he said, voice rough but welcoming. Come in. Inside, the space was simple, filled with books and a fireplace that crackled softly. Laura sat, the familiarity of his presence bringing a brief comfort. Daniel watched her closely as she recounted the events, the pendant, the young woman named Sophia, and the memories that seemed to surface only in fragments. There were things I didn't see back then, Laura admitted, frustration edging her tone. Details that got lost in the rush to find immediate answers. Daniel nodded slowly, sinking into the chair across from her. We all missed something. It's what kept me up at night, long after I left the force. He reached for a worn leather folder on the shelf, flipping through its contents with hands that had held too many unsolved mysteries. Laura leaned forward as he pulled out an old report, eyes narrowing at a familiar name, Victor Hale. He'd been Grant's biggest competitor in the corporate world, a man known for underhanded tactics and cutthroat deals. I remember there was speculation about Hale back then, Daniel said. He had motives, plenty of them, but we could never connect the dots. Too many alibis, too many people willing to protect him. Laura felt a chill settle in her bones. If Hale had been involved, it explained why certain leads had been brushed aside so quickly. Her heart pounded with renewed purpose. It was a trail worth following. Back in the city, Laura returned to her home and found Sophia waiting for her. The young woman looked different, a mix of hope and anxiety in her eyes. She sat curled up on the couch, hands clasped together as if trying to hold herself steady. Laura, Sophia said as soon as the door closed, I need to tell you something. Laura set down her bag and crossed the room, her heart tightening as she sat beside Sophia. What is it? My adoptive parents, Sophia began, her voice low and hesitant. They were always strict. Whenever I asked questions about where I came from or why I didn't look like them, they'd shut me down. My dad especially. He'd say it wasn't important, that I was theirs now and that's all that mattered. Sophia's gaze drifted to the floor, eyes clouded with memories. But there were times I'd catch my mom looking at me like she wanted to say something, like there was something she needed to get off her chest but couldn't. Laura's throat tightened with a mix of protectiveness and anger. The idea of someone suppressing the truth from Sophia, from the child who might be her daughter, made her blood simmer. She reached out, covering Sophia's hand with her own. We're going to find out everything, Laura promised, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Sophia nodded, a small flicker of relief crossing her face. I want to know the truth. I'm ready, whatever it is. The next day, Laura stood with Grant at the city records office, a place that hummed with quiet efficiency. They sifted through file after file, piecing together a story that pointed ever more clearly to Victor Hale. Every line read like a thread that should have been pulled years ago but hadn't. Financial discrepancies, closed-door meetings with officials, and whispered conversations in places where secrets were exchanged. Grant's jaw tightened as they worked, a silent fury building in his chest. He did this, he muttered under his breath, eyes darkening as he looked at Laura. She nodded, their shared determination tangible, a bridge over years of separation. Later that evening, Laura sat across from Sophia once more, the city lights casting shifting patterns across the room. We're getting closer, Laura said softly, the words more a reassurance to herself than anything. Sophia met her gaze, the fear that had lingered behind her eyes starting to give way to something else, hope, tentative and trembling but there. Then let's keep going, she said, lifting her chin just slightly, as if bracing herself for what was to come. Laura reached out again, this time without hesitation. They sat together, hands clasped, the silence around them filled not with uncertainty, but with the quiet hum of a future being rewritten. The phone call came just as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting the city in hues of burnt orange and deep purple. Laura's heart clenched when Daniel's name flashed on her screen. She answered on the second ring, holding her breath as if it would steady the tremor in her voice. Laura, Daniel's voice crackled through, thick with urgency. I found it. Proof that Victor Hale was involved. It's all here, the payments, the witnesses who were silenced. He orchestrated everything. Laura's knees threatened to give way, and she grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, eyes darting to Grant, who was already watching her with narrowed eyes, sensing the shift in the room. "I had some old contacts dig through records that weren't part of the initial case files." Victor made sure to cover his tracks well, but not perfectly, Daniel explained. The sound of shuffling papers came through the line, as if he were holding the evidence in his hands. "I can meet you both tonight." "We'll be there," Laura said, ending the call with a glance at Grant. His eyes met hers, a silent understanding passing between them. This was it, the truth they had both been chasing, with all its sharp edges. An hour later, they sat in Daniel's dimly lit study, a space filled with old books and the scent of tobacco lingering from days long gone. The retired officer laid the files in front of them, each page marked by dates and names that had been whispered about but never linked. Victor Hale's name jumped out, bold as sin, tying together payments to those who had been close to the case, police officials, private informants, even a nurse at the orphanage where Sophia had first appeared. Laura's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, fury building in her chest. Grant sat beside her, his expression dark, jaw set like stone. "He did this to take everything from me," Grant said, voice low, thick with a mix of anger and guilt. Laura's eyes were fierce when they met his. "No. He did this to us. To Emily." The decision was immediate, the need for answers driving Laura forward. She stood, fire in her eyes as she faced Daniel. "I know where I need to go." Raymond, Sophia's adoptive father, lived in a sprawling old house on the edge of the city, a place that looked more imposing than warm. Laura had driven past it more times than she could count over the years, never suspecting it was hiding the truth she craved. Tonight, she wasn't here to speculate, she was here for answers. Sophia insisted on coming with them, nerves evident in the way she fidgeted but refusing to stay behind. The drive was quiet, heavy with the anticipation of what lay ahead. Grant's hand rested on the steering wheel, knuckles white, while Sophia glanced out the window, fingers tracing the pendant around her neck. The door opened after Laura's third knock, revealing Raymond, his face shadowed by confusion that quickly morphed into guarded recognition. He stood in the doorway, blocking entry as he looked from Laura to Grant, then to Sophia, whose presence seemed to unnerve him most. "Raymond," Laura began, voice sharp but controlled, "we know about Victor Hale. We know about Emily." Raymond's face paled, and he shifted, fingers tapping nervously against the doorframe. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You do," Grant cut in, stepping forward, eyes cold and unforgiving. "And you're going to tell us everything." A silence fell, stretching long enough for the sounds of the night to press in, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic. Finally, Raymond stepped back, gesturing them inside with a resigned sigh. They followed him into a dimly lit sitting room where the weight of secrets seemed to hang in the air. Raymond sank into an armchair, hands shaking as he ran them through his thinning hair. Sophia stood beside Laura, eyes wide and questioning. "Why did you take me?" she asked, voice cracking. "Why did you lie to me my whole life?" Raymond looked up, eyes rimmed with regret. "I didn't take you," he said, voice heavy with age and remorse. "I adopted you. But it wasn't as innocent as it should have been." Laura's heart clenched. "Tell us everything," she demanded. Raymond's gaze dropped, his voice growing soft. "Years ago, I was approached by someone from Hale's circle. They told me there was a child who needed a home, no questions asked. They said it was for her safety, that she'd been abandoned and would never be claimed. He swallowed, the weight of his choices pressing visibly on him. I believed them, or maybe I just wanted to believe them because I wanted a child. But I was warned, if I asked too many questions or let anyone look too closely, there would be consequences. Sophia's eyes shone with tears, her hand going to her mouth as the truth settled in. Laura, too, felt a storm of emotions, rage, grief, disbelief. Did you know? She pressed, voice like ice. Did you ever suspect she wasn't just abandoned? Raymond nodded slowly, tears gathering in his eyes. I did, but by then it was too late. Victor's people had made it clear that if I spoke out, it wouldn't end well for her, or for us. The room fell silent, each of them processing what had been revealed. Laura felt an ache in her chest, a raw wound reopened. But there was no time to dwell on it. We need to make this right, Grant said, looking directly at Raymond. This doesn't end here. Raymond's shoulders sagged, and he nodded, resigned to what was coming. Do what you need to do, he whispered. The admission was the final piece, enough to bring everything into sharp focus. Within the hour, police arrived, the quiet house now alive with the blue and red strobe of justice long overdue. Raymond was led away, guilt etched into every line of his face. As he passed Sophia, he paused, eyes full of unsaid words. She looked at him, eyes brimming with sadness and confusion but without the anger Laura expected. It was a look that said she would carry this story, but it would not break her. Laura took Sophia's hand, squeezing it gently. They stood together, the truth finally theirs, with Grant beside them. The future still held questions, but for the first time, it felt like answers were within reach. The morning sun spilled through the window, casting soft light across the sterile room where the DNA results waited in a sealed envelope. The world outside continued with its usual rhythm, unaware of the moment poised to change everything for the people inside. Laura sat at the edge of her chair, fingers clasped tightly, knuckles pale. Sophia stood next to her, silent and still, her gaze fixed on the envelope. Grant, leaning against the wall, exuded a quiet tension, the weight of years bearing down on him. The nurse, who had kindly promised to deliver the results in person, entered and placed the envelope on the table. Her eyes, sympathetic but professional, met Laura's for a brief second before she stepped out, leaving them to their private moment. Laura reached out, her hands trembling as she picked up the envelope. The air felt thick, and she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She looked up at Sophia, who gave a small nod, eyes wide and searching. Laura drew in a deep breath and opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the page. It took only a moment for the words to register, and when they did, a sound halfway between a sob and a gasp escaped her lips. It's her, she whispered, tears spilling over. It's really her. Sophia's eyes filled with emotion, and in a heartbeat, Laura pulled her into an embrace. The room seemed to shrink around them as they clung to each other, 2 decades of longing and pain dissolving into that one, powerful moment. Laura's body shook with sobs, the grief of lost years mingled with the overwhelming joy of having Emily, her Emily, back in her arms. Sophia, or Emily as she now knew herself to be, held on tight, her own tears soaking into Laura's sweater. It was as if some puzzle piece she hadn't known was missing had finally clicked into place, and the weight of an uncertain identity lifted from her. She felt the warmth of Laura's love, strong and unyielding, something she'd dreamed of but never dared to name. Grant stood a few paces away, eyes glassy as he watched them. Relief surged through him, but it was tangled with guilt, a gnawing regret for the years lost, the time that no amount of love or effort could return. His chest felt heavy, as though each memory from that night 20 years ago was pushing down on him all at once. Laura looked up, catching his expression. For a moment, the distance between them seemed insurmountable. Then she extended her arm, silently inviting him to join them. Grant hesitated, feeling the old guilt twist, but stepped forward. He placed his hand on Sophia's back, and for the first time in years, the three of them stood together, connected not just by the pain of the past, but by the fragile hope of the present. "We've found each other," Laura said, her voice breaking but resolute. "We need to hold on to this." Grant nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Instead, he squeezed Sophia's shoulder, the touch conveying what words could not. She looked up at him, a hesitant smile playing at her lips, still wet with tears. There was understanding in her eyes, and a forgiveness that made his heart ache. They spent the day in Laura's living room, the air between them shifting from charged to light, laughter mixing with stories long untold. Laura pulled out photo albums, her fingers tracing the faded images of a tiny, wide-eyed girl who had once been Emily. Sophia leaned forward, absorbing every picture and story, as if trying to knit together the life she'd lost. "Did I really use to make you read that story every night?" Sophia asked, pointing to a picture of Laura with a worn-out children's book in her lap. "Yes," Laura said, chuckling through tears. "Every single night. Even when I could barely keep my eyes open." Grant sat back, watching them reconnect, the tension in his shoulders easing bit by bit. He felt like an outsider in his own family, a penance he'd accepted for not being there when it mattered most. But as the day wore on, Sophia turned to him, eyes bright. "Can we do that again? One of the stories, I mean," she asked, catching him off guard. The invitation wrapped itself around his heart, warming the coldest corners. "I'd like that," he replied, his voice softer than it had been in years. Later, as twilight settled over the city, Laura found Grant on the balcony, gazing out at the skyline. The cool air nipped at their skin, but neither moved to go inside. She stood beside him, the years of distance replaced by a silence that held a strange comfort. "I know what you're thinking," Laura said, turning to look at him. He raised an eyebrow, a small smile breaking through the lines of tension on his face. "Do you?" he asked, his tone teasing but guarded. "Yes," she said, taking a deep breath. "You're blaming yourself. But we can't go back. We can't undo what happened. We can only be here, now, for her." Grant nodded, staring into the deepening blue of the sky. "I know. It's just. I wanted so badly to fix things. To be better." Laura's eyes softened as she reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. "We're both here now. That's what matters. We're not perfect, but we're still her parents. And she needs us." The words settled into Grant's heart, easing the guilt that had long made its home there. He turned to face her, seeing not just the grief they'd shared, but the strength that had carried them through. "Thank you," he said, voice rough with emotion. "For what?" Laura asked, tilting her head. "For reminding me what we're fighting for," he said, eyes locking with hers. It was a start, one that promised the chance of healing, however gradual. Inside, Sophia sat on the couch, a photo album in her lap, glancing up at them through the window. A small smile formed as she watched her parents on the balcony, two figures standing together against the backdrop of nightfall. It was a picture she would keep in her heart, a new beginning after years of questions and shadows. The story of their family wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and for the first time, it felt whole. The aroma of roasting turkey and cinnamon drifted through Laura's home, wrapping it in a sense of warmth that hadn't been felt for years. The table was set with care, plates edged with gold trim gleaming in the afternoon light, surrounded by glasses sparkling with anticipation. Grant adjusted the cutlery for the third time, his hands a little shaky. Hosting Thanksgiving together was an idea they discussed nervously, each carrying their own worries about what it would mean. Yet here they were, poised at the brink of a holiday meant for family, trying to bridge the past with the present. Sophia entered the room, a subtle smile playing on her lips. She wore a simple dress in autumn hues that caught the light, making her eyes shine. She paused, taking in the scene with a mix of wonder and trepidation. Thanksgiving had never been more than a meal with her adoptive parents, the small talk, the usual motions. This was different, it was her past coming full circle. "You look beautiful," Grant said, breaking the quiet. His voice was warm, the kind of tone he once reserved for bedtime stories and moments when he wanted Emily to know she was cherished. The compliment made Sophia's smile widen just a little more. "Thanks, Dad," she said, testing the word for the first time. It felt both strange and comforting. The room held a stillness for a heartbeat as Grant took in the word, the weight of it smoothing some of the creases in his heart. Laura walked in carrying a bowl of mashed potatoes, her eyes twinkling when she saw them together. "We're almost ready," she said, her voice carrying the steady warmth that kept everyone grounded. "Grant, would you grab the rolls from the kitchen?" Grant nodded and disappeared through the swinging door, leaving Laura and Sophia alone. The moment stretched between them, familiar yet new. Laura set the bowl down and looked at her daughter, a surge of pride and affection washing over her. "Are you nervous?" Laura asked, her hand resting lightly on the table as if to steady herself. Sophia hesitated, her fingers brushing the pendant she hadn't taken off since the DNA results came in. "A little. I wasn't sure how it would feel having everyone together like this." Laura reached out, her touch gentle but sure. "It's okay. It's new for all of us. But we're here, and that's what matters." The doorbell rang, breaking the moment and bringing a quick flush of nerves to Sophia's cheeks. Laura straightened, smoothing the folds of her dress. "That'll be your mom," she said softly, meeting Sophia's eyes. Sophia's adoptive mother, Margaret, stood on the porch, wrapped in a navy coat that flapped in the crisp breeze. Her face was lined with worry, eyes searching as Laura opened the door. "Margaret, come in," Laura said, a welcoming smile pushing back the awkwardness. Margaret stepped inside, removing her coat and revealing a kind smile that carried years of love. Her eyes lit up when she saw Sophia, and for a moment, it was as if nothing had changed between them. "Hi, Mom," Sophia said, stepping forward to hug her. The embrace was quick but sincere, bridging the years of shared memories and unspoken truths. Margaret's eyes landed on Laura, a mix of gratitude and unease passing between them. "Thank you for inviting me," she said, her voice a little thick. "I wasn't sure what to expect." Laura nodded, her gaze warm but serious. "We're all here for Sophia. That's what this day is about." Grant returned, balancing a tray of rolls and stopping when he saw Margaret. He offered a nod, acknowledging the complexities in the room. They gathered around the table, an initial tension holding the air taut as they settled into their places. For a moment, silence reigned, filled only by the sound of the fireplace crackling. Laura cleared her throat. "Before we start, I just want to say how grateful I am. We've come through so much to be here, and it means everything to have us sitting at the same table." Her eyes moved to Sophia, softening as they met her daughter's. "This is the start of something we've all waited for." Margaret nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "To new beginnings," she said quietly. The tension dissolved into shared laughter as they started to pass dishes, stories flowing more easily as the meal unfolded. Laura began sharing little anecdotes about Emily's childhood, how she used to hide under the dining room table during thunderstorms, convinced it was her safe spot, or how she would insist on helping in the kitchen, leaving trails of flour everywhere. Sophia's eyes sparkled with delight. "I did that?" she asked, caught between disbelief and joy. "You did," Laura said, laughing. "I found flour in the oddest places for weeks after. I never minded, though." Margaret chimed in, adding her own stories of Sophia's early days. They were different, woven from separate lives, yet they merged seamlessly as everyone shared and listened. Each story laid another thread in the fabric that connected them all. Grant watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling as laughter filled the room. It felt as though they were not just healing but growing, creating new memories that Sophia could hold on to without questioning where she belonged. He reached for Laura's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. She looked at him, surprise giving way to a smile that felt like home. After dinner, they gathered in the living room, where the low light from a nearby lamp cast a golden hue over everything. Sophia sat between Laura and Grant, the warmth of their closeness seeping into her. Margaret sat across from them, a calm acceptance in her eyes as she watched her daughter, now a part of two families that had come together. The last rays of the sun stretched across the room, glinting off the pendant that rested against Sophia's chest. It was no longer just a symbol of what had been lost, it represented everything they had regained. The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that said more than words ever could. As the evening light faded and night took hold, Grant, Laura, and Sophia caught their reflections in the window, standing side by side. They were no longer defined by the gaps between them but by the strength they found in each other. For the first time in years, the past didn't weigh them down, it pushed them forward, together.